Between the Lines of Fate, a story of transmigration, regression, and the love that outlasted death. For every reader who has ever fallen in love with a fictional character and wished they could reach inside the pages to save them. Chapter 1, The Last Page. The night Wei Suian finished the novel, it was raining. He hadn't meant to stay up until 3 in the morning. He hadn't meant to cry, either. But here he was, hunched over his phone in his university dormitory, blanket pulled to his chin, eyes burning from the screen's glow and from tears he hadn't bothered to wipe away. Crimson Fate was a tragedy through and through. 847 chapters of political intrigue, war, betrayal, and love, all building toward the single most devastating ending Wei Suian had ever read. The protagonist, a minor noble named Xin Liangji, had survived imperial assassins, plague years, and 3 separate attempts on his life by jealous court officials. He had survived everything except the person who was supposed to love him, Duke Jiang Chenfeng. The male lead of Crimson Fate was exactly the kind of man fictional literature loved to glorify and real life would have rightfully condemned. Brilliant, beautiful, politically ruthless, and catastrophically selfish in his affections. He had loved Xin Liangji, the novel made that clear in retrospect, but he had loved him the way a fire loves kindling, entirely and destructively. In the end, Jiang Chenfeng's political machinations had placed Xin Liangji in an impossible position. The young noble had been executed for treason he hadn't committed, a crime Jiang Chenfeng had watched the evidence for being fabricated without intervening, because intervening would have cost him the emperor's favor at a critical moment. He had chosen power over love, and Xin Liangji had died at 23, in a prison cell, without ever knowing whether the man who shared his bed had genuinely cared for him at all. Wei Suian set down his phone and stared at the ceiling of his dorm room. What a bastard! He whispered to the dark. He meant Jiang Chenfeng. He also, a little, meant the author, for writing something so beautiful and so merciless. Xin Liangji deserved so much better. He closed his eyes. He did not open them again in the same world. The first thing Wei Suian registered was cold. A bone-deep, biting cold that no amount of blankets could explain. The second thing was the smell. Sandalwood, old paper, and beneath it something metallic that took him an alarming moment to identify as blood. He sat up violently. He was not in his dormitory. He was in a narrow room with stone walls, a single oil lamp guttering on a crude table, and a sleeping mat beneath him that had seen better decades. His hands, when he raised them to his face, were wrong. Slender where his had been broad-palmed, with calluses in different places, and a faint scar on the left index finger that he had never acquired. Wei Suian pressed those wrong hands to his face and breathed very deliberately through the initial wave of panic. Transmigrated, some clinical part of his brain supplied, the part that had read enough web novels to recognize the situation even while the rest of him was screaming. I have transmigrated into a novel. He lowered his hands and looked around the room more carefully, cataloging details. The quality of the lamp oil, the style of the furniture, the particular shade of blue in the folded robe hanging on the wall hook, a style he recognized from the novel's many meticulous descriptions of period dress. Crimson Fate. He had transmigrated into Crimson Fate. Wei Suian sat very still for a long silent moment. Then he reached up and touched his own face with someone else's fingers, and felt the shape of features he had seen described in prose 800 chapters ago. A high forehead, a straight nose, a mouth that the narrative had called soft in repose and sharp in anger. He knew exactly whose body this was. Of course, he thought, with the peculiar calm of someone who has already processed one world-ending shock and cannot afford another. Of course it's Xin Liangji. He was inside the body of the one character in the entire novel who was absolutely, definitively, narratively doomed to die. Chapter 2. The Duke's Eyes. The first time Wei Suian saw Jiang Chenfeng in person, he understood, viscerally and against his own better judgment, why Xin Liangji had loved him. The Duke of Bailing was not conventionally handsome, not in the soft or approachable way. He was tall, angular, built like someone had taken the concept of authority and given it a body. His face was all sharp angles and considered expressions, the face of a man who never said anything without first deciding whether it was worth saying. His eyes were dark, almost black, and Wei Suian had read enough of the novel to know they could be cruel. They could also, he was discovering as Jiang Chenfeng looked at him across the length of a court reception hall, be something else entirely. Wei Suian had arrived at this reception as Xin Liangji, playing a role he'd memorized from the novel with the desperation of someone studying for an exam whose failure condition was death. He knew the character's background: minor noble family, educated, politically uninvolved, known mostly for his calligraphy and his quiet manner. He knew the timeline. He had arrived approximately 2 years before the events that would end in Shen Liangji's execution. 2 years. That was what he had. He was cataloging the exits from the reception hall when he felt it, the weight of being watched. He turned, and found Jiang Chenfeng's eyes on him from across the room. The Duke looked away almost immediately. It was such a small gesture, that looking away. The kind of thing a person did when they had been caught doing something they didn't intend to reveal. Wei Suian, who had read 800 chapters about this man and none of them from the inside, filed the moment away and told himself it meant nothing. It was harder than it should have been. What Wei Suian hadn't anticipated was that Jiang Chenfeng would seek him out. 3 days after the reception, a servant arrived at the Shen family's modest estate with a card requesting the honor of young Master Shen's company for tea. The card was impeccably formal. It was also, by any measure of social hierarchy, wildly unusual. A duke did not call on minor nobles for casual tea. People would talk. Wei Suian stared at the card for a long time. In the novel, this was roughly when Xin Liangji and Jiang Chenfeng's relationship had begun. A meeting arranged under the guise of the duke's interest in calligraphy, which had been genuine enough, but also convenient. The original Xin Liangji had gone to that meeting and come back with his heart already beginning to turn toward someone who would eventually destroy him. Wei Suian was not the original Xin Liangji, but he was in Shen Liangji's body, navigating Shen Liangji's life, and refusing a duke's invitation without cause was its own kind of danger. "Prepare my formal robes," he said to the waiting servant, and tried not to think about how Jiang Chenfeng's eyes had looked in that reception hall. Not cruel at all, for just that moment. Something much harder to name. Chapter 3, What the Regression Left Behind. What Wei Suian did not know, what he could not have known because it had not been in any novel, was what had happened to Jiang Chenfeng before. The Duke of Bailing had died at 41. In a war he had started and could not finish. In a country that had crumbled around him. He had spent the last decade of his life building the empire he'd sacrificed Xin Liangji for, and he had done it with a kind of hollow efficiency, the way a man finishes a task he no longer believes in but cannot stop himself from completing. In the end, he had succeeded. The emperor had rewarded him. He had stood at the height of power he had always wanted and felt nothing but the memory of a prison cell he had never visited, and a face he had watched pale in candlelight years before it paled in death. Xin Liangji had died not knowing if Jiang Chenfeng loved him. Jiang Chenfeng had lived 30 years knowing that he had, and that it hadn't mattered. The gods or fate or whatever governed the turning of time had given him something he had never asked for and did not deserve. A second chance. He had woken up in his own younger body at 31, 10 years before Xin Liangji's death, and he had understood immediately, with the clarity of a man who had lived the alternative, exactly what he intended to do differently. He would not let Xin Liangji die. He did not yet know how to explain that to the young man he had barely spoken to in his first life, the man who was currently looking at him across a tea table with eyes that were somehow, inexplicably wrong, familiar in the way a well-known piece of music is familiar when played in a different key. Jiang Chenfeng poured tea and tried to understand why Xin Liangji's gaze felt like looking at someone new. The tea meeting was careful on both sides in ways neither of them could have explained to the other. Wei Suian was watching for every manipulation the novel had documented. He catalogued Jiang Chenfeng's conversational style, the way he steered without appearing to steer, the way his questions were never quite questions. He was charming, Wei Suian noted with reluctant academic fairness, in the way very intelligent people were sometimes charming. Not by performing warmth but by performing interest, which was rarer and more addictive. The Duke of Bailing was genuinely interested in everything Xin Liangji said. That was the part Wei Suian hadn't expected. In the novel, Jiang Chenfeng's interest had always seemed calculated. Here, in person, it felt almost uncomfortably sincere. "He's different," Wei Suian thought, and then sternly reminded himself that charismatic manipulators always seemed different up close. That was rather the point of them. What he did not notice was the way Jiang Qinfeng's jaw had tightened briefly, when Wei Suian made a dry observation about court poetry that was so sharp and so unlike everything he knew of Xin Liangji's reputation that it had struck him like a stone. "Who are you?" Jiang Qinfeng had thought, looking at the person wearing a face he'd spent 30 years grieving. "Where did you come from?" He had not asked. He had simply poured more tea, and watched, and begun to wonder if the world had given him something stranger than a second chance. Chapter 4. Learning to Breathe Again. 3 months passed. Wei Suian, in the body of a doomed man, had become methodical. He studied the political landscape of the novel with the intensity of a student who knew the exam questions in advance. He knew which court officials were corrupt and which were merely ambitious, which alliances would hold and which would shatter at the first convenient moment. He knew which of Xin Liangji's supposed allies would eventually provide the false evidence for his treason charge. He began, carefully, to build exits. A correspondence with his father's old friend in the southern provinces, innocuous on its surface, the kind of social maintenance minor nobility performed constantly. A renewed interest in land management that explained several visits to properties that happened to be near borders. A reputation for delicate health that made his occasional quiet disappearances from court unsurprising. He was building a way to run. He was also, despite every intention to the contrary, spending a great deal of time with Jiang Qinfeng. This was partly the novel's fault. Their social circles overlapped by design, in ways that were harder to avoid than Wei Suian had anticipated. It was also, he was forced to admit, partly his own fault. Jiang Qinfeng had a library that contained original texts Wei Suian had studied in fragmentary copies. He had access to court records that were useful for Wei Suian's planning. He had a mind that moved like water, always finding the path of least resistance, always arriving exactly where it intended. And he was different. That remained true with every meeting, and it bothered Wei Suian in the way that any data point that refused to fit his model bothered him. "You've been avoiding the Northern Registry clerk?" Jiang Qinfeng said one afternoon, without looking up from the document he was reviewing. They were in his study. Wei Suian had been given free access to the library connected to it, an unusual privilege he had accepted for the strategic value of it. Wei Suian looked up. "He's corrupt." "He is." Jiang Qinfeng turned a page. "Most people don't know that." "I pay attention." The Duke finally looked at him, that direct, considering gaze that Wei Suian had learned to treat as he would a blade pointed in his direction. Not panicking but not ignoring it either. "You pay very particular attention," Jiang Qinfeng said, "to things other people overlook. Things that are not obviously relevant to someone in your position." He set down the document. "Why?" Wei Suian met his eyes steadily. "Is that a problem?" "No." Something shifted in Jiang Qinfeng's expression. Something Wei Suian still didn't have a name for. "It's just that you're not what I expected." "Neither are you," Wei Suian did not say. Instead he looked back at his book and turned a page he hadn't finished reading, and pretended his heart wasn't doing something complicated in his chest. Chapter 5. The Weight of Knowing. Jiang Qinfeng had a recurring dream. In it, Xin Liangji stood in a prison courtyard at dawn, wearing execution white, and turned to look at him. In the dream, unlike in the memory, his expression wasn't afraid. It was something worse. Already resigned, already somewhere else. As though he had made peace with the dying, and was simply waiting for his body to understand what his soul had already accepted. In the dream, he always said the same thing. "Did you know?" Jiang Qinfeng always woke before he could answer in his first life. The answer had been yes. He had known. He had watched the evidence being arranged and done nothing because the calculation had told him that intervention cost too much. He had been, by any measure that mattered, guilty. He had understood that guilt the way a man understands a scar, not as an ongoing wound but as a permanent alteration. Something that had changed the shape of him that would never be otherwise. This version of himself, younger, with the full weight of a future he'd already lived pressing down on him, had decided that guilt was not enough. Guilt without action was just another form of selfishness. He was not interested in feeling terrible. He was interested in Xin Liangji surviving. The problem was that Xin Liangji, or whoever was currently living in Xin Liangji's body, because Jiang Chunfeng was increasingly certain there had been some fundamental change he couldn't account for, was not behaving like someone who needed protecting. He was behaving like someone who was already running. Jiang Chunfeng watched the quiet, careful preparations happening in the margins of Xin Liangji's life. The friendships cultivated in careful geographic distribution, the land acquisitions, the health excuse deployed like a portable shield, and recognized the pattern of a man building an escape route, and felt something twist in his chest that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to both. Who taught you to be this careful? He wondered. And what are you afraid of? He didn't ask. He simply began, more quietly and with greater determination, to remove the obstacles from the path he assumed Xin Liangji couldn't yet see. He neutralized the Northern Registry clerk first. A quiet word to the Imperial Censor's office, evidence that had been sitting in Jiang Chunfeng's possession for years in his first life and that he deployed now with surgical precision. The clerk was removed from his position and sent to a provincial post within the month. The man had been one of the 3 primary architects of the false treason evidence. Wei Suian noticed. He noticed because he'd been tracking that clerk specifically, had been planning his own eventual move against him, and the man was simply gone before Wei Suian had a chance to act. Replaced by someone with a reputation that was actually clean. He sat with this information for 3 days, cross-referenced it against everything he knew about Jiang Chunfeng's political style from the novel, and could not make it fit any selfish motivation he could identify. Unless, a quiet voice in his head suggested, "He's protecting you." Wei Suian dismissed this thought immediately and firmly. Then he thought about the way Jiang Chunfeng's eyes had gone briefly, unmistakably, dark with something that looked like pain the one time Wei Suian had made a self-deprecating comment about his family's declining status. He thought about it for a long time. Chapter 6. The Thing About Fire. 6 months into his transmigration, Wei Suian made a mistake. It was minor by any objective standard. He was at a court gathering and he was tired. He had spent the previous 3 nights working through a set of documents he had quietly obtained, trying to trace the full network of the conspiracy that had doomed the original Xin Liangji, and he was less careful than he should have been. He made a reference to an event that had not yet happened. Small, contextless, the kind of thing that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't already know to look for it. Jiang Chunfeng, standing 6 feet away, went completely still. Wei Suian realized his error the moment the words left his mouth. He smoothed it over immediately, redirecting the conversation with the ease of someone who had spent 6 months practicing exactly this kind of recovery. Nobody else noticed. Jiang Chunfeng noticed. He said nothing. He continued the evening as though nothing had happened. He smiled at the right moments and conversed with the right people and did not once look at Wei Suian in a way that could be interpreted as significant. It was only when Wei Suian was leaving, maneuvering through the crowd toward the door, that a hand closed briefly around his wrist. Just a touch, barely contact at all, gone before he fully registered it. And a voice said very quietly, against the noise of the gathering, "Be careful." Wei Suian turned, but Jiang Chunfeng was already 3 steps away, his back to him, speaking to an imperial minister. "Be careful." Not, "I know something is wrong." Not, "Who are you?" Just, "Be careful." Wei Suian stood in the middle of the gathering and felt the structure of everything he thought he understood shift slightly to the left, and when he got home he sat on his sleeping mat in Xin Liangji's narrow room and pressed his forehead to his knees and asked himself honestly, when exactly he had started to feel safe with Jiang Chunfeng around. The answer was a problem. He told himself it was gratitude. The clerk was gone. 2 of the other conspirators had run into their own quiet difficulties in the months since, the kind of bureaucratic bad luck that didn't announce itself. Whoever was removing the obstacles was doing it cleanly, and Wei Suian was professionally obligated to appreciate clean work. He told himself it was familiarity. He had read 800 chapters about this man. Of course there was a sense of knowing him, even when the knowing was wrong, even when the man in front of him was increasingly, stubbornly different from the man on the page. He did not tell himself it was anything else. But there were evenings in Jiang Chunfeng's library when the Duke fell asleep over his paperwork. This happened more than anyone who thought of him as invulnerable would have guessed, because he slept badly, had since his regression, woke repeatedly from a dream Wei Suian knew nothing about, and Wei Suian would set aside his own reading and look at the face that was usually so carefully composed going unguarded in sleep, and feel something in his chest that had no business being there. You are not who I thought you were, he would think. And I am not who you think I am. And somehow we are here anyway. He didn't know what to do with that. Chapter 7. The storm arrives early. In the novel, the conspiracy against Xin Liangji had taken 2 years to fully develop. Wei Suian had planned accordingly, building his exit routes and dismantling the conspirators' networks with the patience of someone who knew exactly how much time they had. He had miscalculated one thing. The conspiracy could move faster if it felt threatened. The third of the 3 primary architects, a court minister named Pei Wenjiao, was not a stupid man. He had watched his 2 associates encounter difficulties and drawn a conclusion that was directionally correct even if wrong in its details. Someone was working against them. The logical response was to accelerate the timeline. Wei Suian found out on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, from a source he'd cultivated in the ministry offices, that an emergency petition citing Xin Liangji by name was being drafted for the emperor's desk. He had perhaps 3 days. He spent 2 of those days in a cold, very focused panic, activating every exit route he'd built, sending words ahead to the southern contact, arranging his affairs with the specific efficiency of a man who has planned for this and is genuinely hoping the planning is enough. On the 3rd day, Zhang Qinfeng appeared at the Xin estate at dawn without a prior announcement, which he had never done before. Wei Suian opened the door himself. The servants were not yet awake, and looked at the Duke of Bailing standing in his courtyard in travel clothes, with an expression Wei Suian had never seen on him before. Open, in a way that Zhang Qinfeng's face never was. Almost afraid. How long have you known? Zhang Qinfeng asked. Wei Suian had spent 6 months being careful. He looked at this man and the care collapsed. Which part? He asked. About Pei Wenjiao. About the petition. Pause, small and heavy. About any of it. Wei Suian stepped back from the door. You should come inside. They sat across from each other in Xin Liangji's sparse receiving room, and there was no tea this time, no performance of social custom. Zhang Qinfeng had his hands flat on his knees and was watching Wei Suian with the expression of a man who has prepared himself for a difficult conversation and found it more difficult than prepared for. I know you've been dismantling the conspiracy, Wei Suian said, because it was easier to offer a truth than to wait for one. I noticed. I don't know why. Something moved across Zhang Qinfeng's face. Complicated and brief and gone before it could be fully read. Because you were going to die. Xin Liangji was going to. Wei Suian stopped. He started again. He stopped again. He could not explain a novel. He could not explain transmigration. He did not have the words for this conversation in any framework Zhang Qinfeng could be expected to understand. But Zhang Qinfeng was looking at him with eyes that knew things, and Wei Suian had spent 6 months watching this man be different from who the story had told him he was, and he was tired. He was so tired of being careful. I know how this was supposed to end, Wei Suian said finally slowly. I know what happens if I stay. I've been trying to leave. He met Zhang Qinfeng's eyes. Why do you know it too? A long silence. I have lived this before, Zhang Qinfeng said. The words came out stripped of everything except honesty, and Wei Suian recognized that honesty for what it was. Something that had cost this man a great deal. I watched you die. I didn't stop it. His voice was completely level. I have spent this second life trying to fix that. I didn't expect. He paused. You are not the same. No, Wei Suian agreed. I'm not. Who are you? The question landed between them like something fragile. Wei Suian looked at his hands, these hands that still felt slightly wrong, that he'd spent months learning to inhabit, and thought about what was honest and what was safe and decided that after 6 months of choosing safety, he might be allowed one honest thing. I'm someone who read about what happened to Xin Liangji, he said, and wanted to save him, and then woke up being him. He looked up. I read about you too. And you were, he stopped, chose his words. The version of you that I read about was not someone I would have trusted. Zhang Qinfeng absorbed this without flinching, which said something about him. He wasn't someone worthy of trust. Steady. I know that. But you're not him. No, Zhang Qinfeng said. I am trying very hard not to be. They looked at each other across the sparse room, across the gap between a past Wei Suian had read and a present neither of them had expected. And Wei Suian felt the last of his carefully maintained distance develop a crack it would not recover from. Pei Wenjiao's petition reaches the emperor in 2 days, he said. I have a route south. It's not complete, but it's functional. He paused. Why did you come here at dawn? Because I was not going to let you run alone, Zhang Chunfeng said, as though this were obvious. Not again. Wei Suian stared at him. What do you mean, again? And then Zhang Chunfeng told him about the end of the first life, about the prison cell he had never visited, the execution he had not attended because he could not have borne it, the 30 years of building an empire over a grave he had made, and Wei Suian listened, and felt the crack in his distance widen into something that could no longer be called a crack at all. Chapter 8 What Comes After. They ran south. It was not graceful. The petition reached the emperor a day early. Pei Wenjiao had moved faster than anticipated. Perhaps because he'd seen Zhang Chunfeng at the Shin estate and correctly assessed that the timeline had collapsed, and the first half of the journey was made in a state of sustained, focused urgency that left no room for anything except movement. Zhang Chunfeng had prepared for this. Wei Suian was irritated later to discover how thoroughly documents, a route, contacts along the way, a destination in the south that was as legitimate as anything could be in the circumstances. He had been building this in parallel with everything Wei Suian had been building, and their plans had overlapped in 3 places without either of them knowing. You were running, Zhang Chunfeng said on the second night, when they had stopped at a farmhouse belonging to an old associate, and the urgency had eased enough for conversation. I thought you didn't know the danger. I knew, Wei Suian said. I've always known. Then why didn't you? Zhang Chunfeng stopped. Come to you. Wei Suian looked at the fire they built in the farmhouse hearth, small and practical. You were in the novel Zhang Chunfeng. I read about what you did. It was... He searched for the honest word. It was very hard to trust someone after reading that. I know. No defensiveness. Just the simple acknowledgement. The version of you in the story never warned him. He watched Xin Liangji get framed and he didn't say a word, because the political cost was too high. Wei Suian turned to look at him. Every time you were kind to me, I was waiting for the calculation. For the moment when I became too expensive. Zhang Chunfeng was quiet for a moment. Did it come? No. Wei Suian turned back to the fire. That's what I couldn't make sense of. I made that calculation once, Zhang Chunfeng said. I spent the rest of my first life understanding exactly what it cost. Not me, him. What it cost him. A pause. I had already decided, when I woke in this body, that there was no version of anything in which you were too expensive. There was no emperor, no office, no political position worth that cost. He looked at Wei Suian's profile in the firelight. I'm sorry it took so long to become someone you could believe that from. Wei Suian closed his eyes. He thought about Xin Liangji, the original, the one who had died in a prison cell without this conversation, without any conversation, and felt a grief for someone he had never been that was strange and genuine and probably not going anywhere. He would have wanted to know, he said quietly, the real Xin Liangji, that you loved him. He died not knowing. I know, Zhang Chunfeng said. His voice had roughened slightly. That's the thing I can't fix. I can only, he stopped. Try differently this time, Wei Suian finished. Yes. Wei Suian opened his eyes and looked at him, this man who had lived one life terribly and was spending the second one in penance, and thought about the particular cruelty of being given a second chance to love someone who had already been replaced by a stranger wearing their face. I'm not him, he said. Not for the first time, but it felt necessary to say again. I know. Zhang Chunfeng met his eyes, steady and clear. I have known for some time. Whatever you are, whoever you are, it is you I've been trying to protect. Not a memory. A brief, complicated pause. I realize this may be difficult to believe, given the circumstances. Wei Suian considered this for a long time, in the silence of a farmhouse with a small fire, in a world that wasn't his but that had become, over 6 careful, exhausting, increasingly complicated months. Something like real that it's not that difficult, he said finally, and meant it. They reached the southern provinces 11 days later. The political situation resolved itself with less catastrophe than Wei Suian had prepared for, partly because Zhang Qinfeng had spent his first life learning exactly how imperial crises resolved and deployed that knowledge with precision, and partly because Pei Wenjiao's overreach had made enemies of people who were now motivated to provide evidence of their own. The petition collapsed. An investigation was launched in the other direction. Xin Liangji, Wei Suian in Xin Liangji's life, was recalled to court several months later, cleared of implications that had never been official, greeted with the polite indifference of a court that had already moved on to the next crisis. He declined to return. The estate in the south was modest and required work and sat on a hillside that looked over a river valley that was genuinely beautiful. Wei Suian, who had grown up in a 21st century city and had never gardened in his life, discovered he had opinions about irrigation. He discovered this while arguing with the previous estate manager, and realized halfway through the argument that he was using knowledge he hadn't known he had, Xin Liangji's knowledge, layered under his own, available in moments of particular focus. Thank you, he thought, to whoever or whatever the original had been, for sharing this with me. He planted a garden. Zhang Qinfeng arrived at the southern estate on a morning in spring, having resigned from his court position with a letter that was, by all accounts, impeccably worded and entirely unapologetic. He appeared at the gate with 2 traveling cases and an expression of polished calm that did not quite conceal something underneath that Wei Suian was now, after all this time, able to read. You resigned, Wei Suian said, from where he was standing in the garden with dirt on his hands. Your entire political career. Yes, that was, you spent decades building that career. In the first life and this one. I did. Zhang Qinfeng agreed. He looked at the garden. He looked at Wei Suian's dirty hands. Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. It turned out I valued it less than I thought. Wei Suian looked at him for a long moment. This man who had lived one whole life for power and was standing at a garden gate in the south having thrown it away, and felt the last of the careful structure he'd maintained around his own feelings develop not a crack but a door, swinging open with the particular ease of something that had always been going to open eventually. There's a room, he said. The east one, it has a window that faces the river. I thought it might suit someone who... He stopped. Reorganized. I thought it might suit you. Zhang Qinfeng stepped through the gate. Yes, he said simply. I think it will. Chapter 9. The name of what we are. Time passed the way it does when the emergency is over and the surviving begins. Not in dramatic chapters but in the accumulation of ordinary days, each one smaller and more sustainable than the crisis that preceded them. Wei Suian learned to be Xin Liangji and to be himself simultaneously, the way a river learns the shape of its banks. He wrote letters in 2 different styles, one for the court contacts he was slowly, carefully rebuilding, one for himself in a language that was partly the original Xin Liangji's hand and partly something that belonged entirely to him. He read voraciously, drawing on the estate's growing library and on Zhang Qinfeng's extensive personal collection, which had arrived in crates 2 weeks after Zhang Qinfeng himself. He argued about irrigation with the estate manager and was frequently wrong and almost always learned something. He planted more than the garden could reasonably hold and watched it become beautiful in the chaotic way that happens when someone plants from enthusiasm rather than plan. He sat across from Zhang Qinfeng at dinner and talked about everything court politics they were no longer part of, the estate's finances, books, the particular quality of the river light in different seasons, memories that were Xin Liangji's and that Wei Suian had come to think of with a kind of custodial care, as things he was holding rather than things he owned. He did not talk about his original world. There were no words for it that fit inside this one, and besides, he was increasingly unsure of the distance between what had been real and what was real now. The dormitory room with its phone screen and its rain felt like something that had happened to another person, which in the most literal sense it had. Zhang Qinfeng did not ask. He had the patience of a man who had already made the catastrophic error of prioritizing information over presence, and was not going to repeat it. He asked other things instead, small things, daily things, the kinds of questions that built a person from the accumulated answers. What did Wei Suian think of the new variety of tea they'd ordered from the market? Why did he always read standing up when he was excited about something? When he made that expression, the specific one slightly to the left, more in the eyes than the mouth, what was he thinking about? Wei Suian answered, and answered, and discovered over the course of months that being known was different from being seen. Jiang Chunfeng had seen him clearly from very early on. Being known took longer and was quieter and was somehow more. The conversation happened in autumn, almost a full year after the estate, when the garden had done the beautiful chaotic thing Wei Suian had hoped for and the river valley had gone amber and gold in a way that the original Xin Liangji's memories told him was particularly fine this year. They were sitting on the veranda in the late afternoon, and Wei Suian had been reading and Jiang Chunfeng had been writing something, and the silence had the quality of long familiarity, comfortable and textured. Wei Suian looked up from his book, looked at Jiang Chunfeng's profile against the amber light, and felt the whole accumulation of the year settle into something clear. "I'm in love with you," he said. "Not, I think I might be. Not, this is complicated." Just the simple statement of a thing that had been true for long enough that qualifying it seemed dishonest. Jiang Chunfeng set down his brush and looked at him. In that look was everything Wei Suian had learned to read in a face that had taken months to become legible. The relief and the grief that never quite left, and beneath both of them something that was very old and very steady and had probably been there since before Wei Suian arrived to find it. "I have loved you," Jiang Chunfeng said. "Longer than is quite fair to explain." Wei Suian thought about that, about the first life, the second chance, the 30 years of guilt, and the very specific shape of what it looked like when someone decided to be better, and felt that love the way you feel something that has survived difficulty, not fragile but tempered. "That's a very complicated sentence," he said. "Yes," Jiang Chunfeng agreed. "You deserve a much simpler one." He looked at Wei Suian with those dark, clear eyes that had never been cruel in this life. Not once. Not with him. "I love you. Who you are. Whatever that is and wherever it came from." A pause. "Is that simple enough?" Wei Suian set down his book. "Yes," he said. "That's simple enough." He crossed the veranda and Jiang Chunfeng stood to meet him, and there on the threshold of the room that faced the river, with the amber light of the valley behind them and a garden that was more alive than planned, they came together with the specific gentleness of people who had both been broken and had both decided not to break the other. It was not a perfect moment. Wei Suian had dirt on his hands, still, from the morning's work. Jiang Chunfeng's brush had left an ink smear on his wrist that neither of them noticed until later. The river made its sound below them, and the garden smelled of late-season chrysanthemums, and somewhere in the estate a door had been left open that the autumn wind was doing something to. It was an ordinary moment. It was, Wei Suian thought, with every part of himself that was both who he had been and who he had become, the most beautiful thing he had ever been part of. In the 5th year of their life at the southern estate, Wei Suian stopped waiting to wake up. It wasn't a decision he made deliberately. He simply noticed one morning that he had been planning for winter as though he would be here for it, planning for the spring planting as though he would be here for that too, thinking about the future the way people think about something they are actually going to have. He mentioned this to Jiang Chunfeng over tea. Jiang Chunfeng set down his cup and looked at him with an expression that belonged entirely to this life and no other, the one that was unguarded in a way his first life self had probably never managed. "Good," he said. Wei Suian drank his tea and looked out the window at the garden, which had finally, after years of enthusiastic overplanting, achieved something approaching the beautiful chaos he'd always been aiming for. "Good," he agreed. Epilogue. The real Xin Liangji. What the novel never said, what perhaps even its author did not know, was what happened on the night Xin Liangji died. He had been in the prison cell for 11 days. He was 23 years old and he had not been afraid, not precisely, though he had been cold and hungry and very tired. What he had been was sad. Not for himself, he had made a kind of peace with the end of himself, which perhaps came easier to someone who had always expected life to be brief, but for the waste of it. For the things he'd wanted to see and hadn't. For the books he hadn't finished reading. For the question he'd never gotten to ask. He thought about Jiang Chunfeng in those last days. Not with anger, he was too tired for anger, and anger required a future to direct itself toward. He thought about him the way you think about a fire you sat beside on a cold night. Not as something you owned, but as something that had been warm while it lasted. Did he love me? He hadn't been able to answer it, lying on the cold floor of the cell, and he had decided, in the way that people make decisions when they have no more time, that perhaps not knowing was its own kind of ending. He had loved. That was real regardless of what it had returned. What came after, Xinliangji did not have a theology for what came after. He had only the cold, and the lamp going out, and the particular silence of a world proceeding without him in it. He did not know about the regression. He did not know about the transmigration. He did not know that his name, his face, his memories, and his careful calligraphy hands would become the vessel for someone else's survival and, eventually, someone else's love. But there is something, in the space between deaths and second chances, in whatever exists at the margins of narrative and fate, that is perhaps not knowing but something adjacent to it. A sense of a garden growing somewhere in the south. A river valley going amber in autumn. Two people on a veranda in the late afternoon light, coming together with the gentleness of people who have both decided to stay. Xinliangji, at 23, had loved a man who did not know how to love him back. Somewhere in the continuing of things that man was learning. It was not his happiness, he was past needing that. But it was, in some unnameable way, a kind of completion. He had planted something after all. Even if it was someone else who grew it. Even if the garden was not his. It was enough. The chrysanthemums bloomed in autumn. They always do. End.